Have you ever stopped to think about what a woman is capable of doing when everything has been taken from her? I mean everything. Her children, her body, her future, her very right to exist as a human being. Because today, I'm going to tell you about a woman whose name was erased from official records, whose face was never painted, whose grave was never marked. And yet, somehow she became the most feared presence in the entire Appalachian mountain region during the darkest years of American slavery. They called her many things. The masters whispered about her in terror. The enslaved spoke her name like a prayer. She was the woman who decided that if she could not give life to freedom, she would give death to bondage. And what she did, the method she perfected, the silent war she waged from the very heart of the plantation system, it changed everything. It terrified an entire class of slaveholders so deeply that they began writing desperate letters to governors, to militia commanders, begging for protection against something they could not see, could not prove, could not stop. If you want to understand how one woman, armed with nothing but knowledge and absolute determination, brought an empire of cruelty to its knees, then stay with me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is dedicated to uncovering the stories they never wanted you to hear. The stories of resistance, the stories of those who refuse to be broken. And this one, I promise you, will never leave your mind. There is a valley in the Appalachian Mountains where the old-timers still refuse to build houses. They will not tell you why, not directly, not with plain words. They speak around it, through it, gesturing toward the mist that settles in the hollows at dawn, pointing at the particular way the wind sounds when it passes through the gap in the ridgeline where Hartwell Plantation once stood. Nothing remains there now. No columns, no foundations, not even the stones that once marked the boundaries of the property. The forest has reclaimed everything, as forests do, patient and absolute in their erasure. But something lingers. The locals call it the Cold Womb Hollow, and pregnant women from the surrounding counties have avoided that place for nearly 200 years. They say the ground itself is barren. They say nothing grows right there, that the soil produces stunted crops, that livestock brought to graze in those meadows birth stillborn young at rates that defy explanation. Science has no answer for this. Geologists have tested the soil. Veterinarians have examined the animals. Everything appears normal on paper, and yet the pattern persists, generation after generation, a wound in the earth that refuses to heal. The enslaved people who once worked this land knew the truth. They understood what had happened here, what had been done, what had been chosen. They passed the story down in whispers, in songs that seemed to be about something else entirely. In the particular way grandmothers would touch their bellies when the name was spoken. Her name was Patience, and she was the most successful mass murderer in Appalachian history. Not because she killed with violence, not because she struck down her enemies with weapons or poison in the traditional sense. She killed with absence, she killed with prevention. She killed futures before they could begin. The masters of Hartwell Plantation wanted her to bring life into the world. She decided instead that no life would ever come to completion under their roof, and for 7 years, not a single child born on that property drew breath for more than 3 days. If you want to follow more cases like this one, cases that shake the very foundations of what we think we know about history and reveal truths that have been deliberately hidden, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a single investigation. The Hartwell Plantation sprawled across 1,800 acres of prime Appalachian bottomland in what would later become eastern Tennessee. In 1847, it was considered one of the most profitable agricultural operations in the entire Mountain South, a distinction that puzzled many observers. The Appalachian region was not known for large-scale plantation agriculture. The terrain was too rough, the growing season too short, the transportation networks too primitive. Most mountain farms operated on a smaller scale, with fewer enslaved workers, different crops, different rhythms. But Solomon Hartwell had ambition that exceeded his geography. He had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him, and with each generation the property had expanded, absorbing neighboring farms through purchase, foreclosure, and occasionally through means that were never discussed in polite company. By the time Solomon took control in 1839, Hartwell Plantation held 112 enslaved people, an enormous number for the region. They worked tobacco primarily, but also corn, wheat, and a small apple orchard that produced cider famous throughout 3 counties. The big house sat on a rise overlooking the valley, a federal-style mansion with white columns and green shutters that Solomon had built to replace his father's more modest dwelling. He wanted the world to see his success. He wanted travelers on the turnpike below to look up and understand exactly who controlled this valley. The house had 14 rooms, a wine cellar, a library stocked with books Solomon never read, and a nursery on the 3rd floor that he had constructed specifically for the children he intended to produce with his wife Margaret, and the children he intended to breed from his enslaved women, because Solomon Hartwell understood something that many of his neighbors refused to accept. Slavery was a numbers game. The importation of enslaved Africans had been banned since 1808. The only way to increase your workforce, to expand your empire, to grow your wealth, was to grow it from within. And Solomon intended to grow his empire substantially. The slave quarters at Hartwell stretched along the creek bottom in 2 parallel rows, 12 cabins on each side, with a wider central building that served as a nursery and sick house. This arrangement was unusual for the region and revealed Solomon's particular philosophy regarding his human property. Most mountain slaveholders housed their enslaved workers in whatever structures were available, sometimes in the same buildings as livestock, sometimes in lean-tos attached to barns. Solomon believed in systematic management. He had read the agricultural journals. He had corresponded with planters in the Deep South. He understood that healthy, well-maintained workers produced more and lasted longer, and more importantly, that women who were properly fed and housed during pregnancy were more likely to deliver living children. The nursery was his particular innovation, a building dedicated entirely to childbirth and infant care. It had a fireplace at each end to maintain constant warmth. It had windows positioned to maximize light while minimizing drafts. It had rope beds with corn shuck mattresses, clean linens changed weekly, and a designated caretaker whose only job was to attend to expecting mothers and newborn infants. Solomon was proud of this nursery. He showed it to visitors as evidence of his progressive methods, his enlightened approach to the peculiar institution. He calculated that a healthy enslaved infant represented approximately $300 of future value at birth, increasing to $800 by age 10, and potentially $1,200 by adulthood. He saw no contradiction between this arithmetic and his self-image as a Christian gentleman. The enslaved people saw the nursery differently. They saw it as a factory that produced not goods, but human beings, not for their own families, but for Solomon's ledger book. They watched as women were selected for breeding based on their physical characteristics, paired with men chosen for their strength and health, monitored throughout their pregnancies like livestock, and then separated from their children as soon as the children were old enough to be sold. The nursery was not a place of care, it was a place of harvesting. Patients arrived at Hartwell Plantation in the spring of 1841, purchased from an estate sale in Virginia following the death of a doctor named Aldridge, who had owned her since her birth. She was 23 years old, tall for a woman, with hands that the bill of sale described as remarkably steady and a demeanor characterized as intelligent and compliant. What the bill of sale did not mention, what Solomon Hartwell would not discover until much later, was that Patience had spent her entire life in the household of a physician, not working in his fields, not serving in his kitchen, working in his practice. Dr. Aldridge had been an unusual man, a bachelor with more interest in medicine than social convention, and he had recognized something in the child Patience that he rarely saw in anyone, an intuitive understanding of the human body, a stillness under pressure, an ability to observe and remember with perfect accuracy. He had trained her first as a nurse, then as a surgical assistant, and finally, in the last years of his life, as something approaching a colleague. She could set bones. She could stitch wounds. She could diagnose fevers and identify infections. She could mix medicines and calculate dosages. She could, when necessary, perform procedures that most country doctors would have botched, and most importantly, most secretly, most dangerously. She understood the mysteries of pregnancy and childbirth in ways that even many physicians did not. She knew which herbs brought on labor and which delayed it. She knew which roots could prevent conception and which could end it. She knew the anatomy of the womb, the stages of fetal development, the precise timing of vulnerability and viability. Dr. Aldridge had taught her everything, and when he died, his family had sold her without any understanding of what they were selling. Solomon Hartwell bought her because she could read, which he considered useful for household management. He had no idea he had just purchased the instrument of his eventual destruction. Leave a comment below saying, "Never give up on the truth," if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The first year at Hartwell, Patience watched and waited. She performed her assigned duties with perfect competence, serving as a household servant under the supervision of the white housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson. She cleaned, she laundered, she helped in the kitchen during large meals. She said little and observed everything. She learned the routines of the plantation, the hierarchies among the enslaved workers, the particular cruelties favored by each overseer, the layout of every building, the timing of every bell. She identified which enslaved people could be trusted and which had been broken into collaboration with the masters. She noted where medicines were stored, which plants grew in the forest surrounding the property, which streams ran clean, and which carried contamination from upstream farms. At night, in the cabin she shared with 3 other women, she began to share her knowledge carefully, selectively, establishing herself as someone who could help with ailments, ease pain, and treat the constant injuries that plantation labor produced. She set a dislocated shoulder for a field hand named Marcus. She lanced an abscess on the leg of an elderly woman named Ruth. She prepared a tea that eased the breathing of a child with lung fever. Word spread quietly, as such word always does among the oppressed, and soon Patience had become something essential. The person you went to when official help was forbidden, inadequate, or too dangerous to seek. Solomon noticed her skills within 6 months. One of his prized horses had developed a leg infection that the local veterinarian could not treat, and in desperation, he allowed Patience to examine the animal after hearing from his overseer that she had some knowledge of medicine. She saved the horse. She drained the infection properly, applied a poultice of her own making, and within 2 weeks the animal was sound again. Solomon was impressed but not surprised. He had encountered skilled enslaved people before. What surprised him was the calmness with which Patience worked, the methodical precision, the way she seemed to understand not just what to do, but why she was doing it. He began to assign her more medical responsibilities, first with the livestock, then with the enslaved workers, then finally with his own family. When Margaret Hartwell developed a persistent digestive complaint that the town doctor could not cure, it was Patience who identified the cause: contaminated flour from a poorly stored barrel. When Solomon himself suffered from recurring headaches, Patience prepared a remedy from willow bark that worked better than anything the apothecary had sold him. By the end of 1842, she had become indispensable. She still lived in the slave quarters, still wore the coarse clothing of bondage, still was considered property in the eyes of law and custom. But she moved through the plantation with unusual freedom, entering buildings that other enslaved people could not approach, accessing supplies that were normally locked away, spending hours alone in the presence of white people who barely noticed her watching them. She had built exactly the position she needed. The catalyst came in March of 1843. Her sister Comfort had been sold to Hartwell 3 months earlier, part of the same estate liquidation that had dispersed the Aldridge property. Comfort was younger than Patience by 4 years. Softer in temperament, less skilled in the medical arts, but sweet-natured and loving. They had been separated once before, when Comfort was briefly sent to work at a neighboring property, and both sisters had been devastated. The reunion at Hartwell felt like a gift, and for those first months, despite the horrors of their situation, Patience allowed herself to feel something like hope. They could be together. They could protect each other. They could perhaps even plan for some kind of future. Then Solomon Hartwell selected Comfort for the breeding program. The selection process was methodical, almost clinical. Solomon himself examined the women he chose, checking their teeth, their skin, the width of their hips, the fullness of their breasts. He looked for signs of good health, good constitution, what he called breedability. Comfort met all his criteria. She was 19, healthy, strong. She had regular menstrual cycles, which the overseer tracked in a ledger. She had never been pregnant before, which Solomon preferred, because it meant her body had not been damaged by previous births. He assigned her to a man named Caesar, a field hand known for his physical strength, and he ordered them to begin attempting conception immediately. The assignment was not a suggestion. Refusal meant punishment, and not just for Comfort. Solomon had learned that threatening the people an enslaved person loved was more effective than threatening the person directly. If Comfort did not comply, Patience would be whipped. If Caesar did not comply, his elderly mother would be sold. This was how the system functioned. This was how it had always functioned. The chains of affection became chains of control. Comfort became pregnant in July of 1843. Patience knew before anyone else, recognized the subtle signs that she had been trained to identify. The slight changes in skin tone, the altered patterns of appetite, the particular kind of fatigue that announced new life taking root. She did not tell her sister immediately. Instead, she went into the forest alone, walking for hours along paths she had memorized, until she reached a clearing where she knew she would not be observed. And there, in the silence of the Appalachian woods, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not allow this child to be born into slavery. Not this child, not any child on this plantation, not ever again. The masters wanted to grow their empire through the bodies of enslaved women. Patience would ensure that the empire stopped growing. She would become the end of the line, the termination point, the cold womb that consumed futures before they could begin. It was not a decision she made lightly. She understood exactly what she was contemplating. She understood the moral weight, the spiritual implications, the profound violation of everything she had been taught about the sanctity of life. But she also understood something else, something that overrode all other considerations. A child born into slavery at Hartwell would suffer a fate worse than non-existence. A child born at Hartwell would be property, would be sold, would be beaten, worked, used and discarded, would likely never know freedom, never know autonomy, never know what it meant to own one's own body. Was it mercy or murder to prevent such a life? Patience did not know. She only knew that she had the power to prevent it, and she had made her choice. She began with Comfort's pregnancy. The method was elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its effectiveness. Patience had access to the plantation's medical supplies. She had access to the forest's pharmacopoeia. She had access, most importantly, to the pregnant women themselves through her role as the plantation's informal medical provider. She knew which substances, administered in precise doses at precise times, would terminate a pregnancy early enough that it would appear to be a natural miscarriage. She knew which substances would prevent implantation altogether if given during the fertile window. She knew how to induce labor prematurely, how to cause complications that would appear accidental, how to ensure that even pregnancies that progressed to term would not result in living children. She did not act indiscriminately. She did not harm the mothers. Her goal was not cruelty but prevention. She selected her targets carefully, women who had been forced into the breeding program against their will, women who had begged her privately for help, women whose children would certainly be sold away from them. She counseled each woman first, ensuring they understood what she was offering, ensuring they wanted to accept. Most did, some did not, and Patience respected their choices, provided what prenatal care she could, and mourned privately when those children were born into bondage. But for those who chose otherwise, Patience became the angel of absence, the mother of the cold womb, the woman who ensured that Solomon Hartwell's human crop would never come to harvest. Comfort's pregnancy ended in August, 8 weeks after conception, appearing to all observers as a spontaneous miscarriage. Patience was there to provide care, to stop the bleeding, to comfort her sister through the loss, while hiding her own role in causing it. Comfort knew the truth. She had asked for it. She had chosen it. But the grief was still real, still profound, a mourning for the possibility that could never be. Solomon Hartwell was disappointed, but not concerned. Miscarriages were common. He would simply have Comfort try again. And she did try again, 3 more times over the next 2 years, each pregnancy ending the same way, each loss recorded in Solomon's ledger as an unfortunate but natural occurrence. Meanwhile, other pregnancies across the plantation were failing at rates that gradually began to attract attention. In 1842, before Patience fully implemented her method, 9 children had been born at Hartwell, of whom 7 survived infancy. In 1843, only 4 children were born, and 3 of them died within their first week. In 1844, 6 pregnancies resulted in only 2 live births, both of whom died before their first month. In 1845, Not a single pregnancy on the entire plantation resulted in a surviving child. Solomon Hartwell began keeping more detailed records. He brought in doctors from Knoxville, from Nashville, from as far away as Charleston. They examined the women. They tested the water. They inspected the food supply. They found nothing. Every test, every investigation, every consultation led to the same conclusion. There was no explicable cause for the epidemic of failed pregnancies and infant deaths. The women appeared healthy. The environmental conditions appeared normal. The problem appeared to be a matter of extraordinarily bad luck, or perhaps, some suggested in hushed tones, divine displeasure. The enslaved community knew better. They understood that something deliberate was happening, though most did not know the details. Patience had been careful to maintain secrecy, working only with women who had actively sought her help, never discussing her methods openly, never leaving evidence that could be traced back to her. But secrets have a way of spreading, especially among the oppressed, who often survive by knowing what the masters do not. Whispers began to circulate in the slave quarters, not about patience specifically, but about a presence, a force, something that had descended upon Hartwell to prevent the masters from growing their empire of flesh. Some called it a curse. Some called it a blessing. Some called it the cold womb, a spirit that had taken residence in the plantation, making the land itself hostile to the birth of enslaved children. The name spread beyond Hartwell, carried by enslaved people who were sold away, by travelers who passed through, by the underground networks of communication that connected enslaved communities across vast distances. Other plantations in the region began reporting similar problems: elevated rates of miscarriage, stillbirth, infant mortality. Whether these were the direct result of Patience's work, or the result of other women inspired by her example, or simply the natural consequences of the brutal conditions on those properties, no one could say for certain. But the pattern was clear enough that slaveholders began to panic. Their investment in human reproduction was failing. Their workforce was not replenishing itself. Their wealth, their power, their entire way of life depended on the enslaved population continuing to grow. And somehow, impossibly, inexplicably, that growth had stopped. Solomon Hartwell became obsessed with solving the mystery. He was losing thousands of dollars annually in unrealized human property. He was becoming a laughingstock among his peers, the man whose plantation could not produce children. He increased surveillance on the pregnant women, requiring them to be monitored at all hours, to eat only food prepared in the big house kitchen, to drink only water drawn from specific wells. He brought in a white midwife from Virginia, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, who came highly recommended and who was tasked with overseeing all aspects of prenatal care. He even, in a moment of desperation, consulted a fortune teller from Knoxville, who claimed to be able to lift curses. Nothing worked. The pregnancies continued to fail. The infants continued to die. Mrs. Patterson was baffled, unable to identify any cause for the pattern she was witnessing. The fortune teller took Solomon's money and departed without providing any useful insight. The surveillance proved impossible to maintain consistently, and besides, the problem seemed to extend beyond any single person or any single action. It was as if the very capacity for life had been drained from the plantation itself, as if the wombs of the enslaved women had collectively decided to refuse their function as factories for producing more human property. Patience continued her work throughout this period, adapting her methods to the increased scrutiny. When certain herbs became impossible to obtain without suspicion, she found alternatives. When certain women became too closely watched to receive direct treatment, she taught them to treat themselves, passing knowledge through coded conversations and hidden demonstrations. When Mrs. Patterson began to suspect that something deliberate was occurring, Patience befriended her, gained her trust, and subtly misdirected her investigations toward environmental factors that had nothing to do with the actual cause. She was patient, methodical, and utterly committed to her purpose. Each failed pregnancy was a victory. Each infant that never drew breath was a soul that never had to experience the horrors of bondage. Each month that passed without a successful birth brought Hartwell Plantation one step closer to the demographic collapse that would eventually destroy it. She did not know how long she could continue. She did not know when she would be discovered. She only knew that every day she succeeded was a day she had struck a blow against the system that had stolen everything from her and everyone she loved. By 1847, Solomon Hartwell was financially ruined. 6 years without any significant increase in his enslaved workforce, combined with the normal attrition from death, illness, and sale to cover debts, had reduced his holdings from 112 people to 63. His creditors were pressing for repayment. His wife had left him, returning to her family in Charleston after the deaths of 3 children she had borne him, children whose loss she attributed to the curse she believed hung over the plantation. His reputation was destroyed, his health was failing, and his once magnificent estate was crumbling around him. He had sold off parcels of land, pieces of furniture, his wife's jewelry, his father's silver, everything he could convert to cash to keep the operation running. But the operation was no longer running. It was staggering toward collapse, sustained only by Solomon's stubborn refusal to accept the reality of his situation. The enslaved people could see the end approaching. They whispered about it at night, making plans, assessing possibilities, wondering what would happen when Hartwell finally fell. Some hoped they would be freed. Others feared they would be sold south, to the cotton fields and sugar plantations, where conditions were even more brutal than the mountain south. Others planned to run, knowing that the chaos of a plantation collapse might provide the opportunity they needed to escape. Patience made her own plans. She had been preparing for this moment for years, accumulating knowledge of escape routes, hiding places, sympathetic contacts in the surrounding region. The Underground Railroad had tentacles that reached into the Appalachian Mountains, and Patience had identified several of them, establishing connections that could be activated when the time was right. She intended to lead as many people to freedom as possible, using the confusion of Hartwell's collapse as cover. She shared her plans with a small circle of trusted allies, her sister Comfort, the man Caesar, who had been forced to serve as Comfort's breeding partner and who had become a fierce resistor in his own right, an older woman named Ruth, who served as the spiritual center of the enslaved community, and a young man named Gabriel, who had been trained as a blacksmith and whose skills would be essential for breaking chains and forging tools. Together, they formed the core of what would become the Hartwell Exodus, one of the largest and most successful mass escapes in Appalachian history. The opportunity came in September of 1847. Solomon Hartwell had finally accepted the inevitable and agreed to sell the plantation to a consortium of creditors who intended to break it up and sell the parcels separately. The enslaved people were to be auctioned as a group in Knoxville, a fate that terrified everyone because it meant separation, dissolution of the community they had built, destruction of the family bonds that had sustained them through everything. Patience had 1 week between the announcement of the sale and the scheduled departure for Knoxville. 1 week to organize an escape for 63 people across some of the most rugged terrain in eastern North America. 1 week to accomplish what most experts would have said was impossible. She did it in 5 days. The exodus began at midnight on September 14, 1847, with Patience leading the first group of 20 people into the forest north of the plantation. They moved in silence, following paths she had mapped over 6 years of preparation, guided by stars she had learned to read and landmarks she had memorized. Behind them, Caesar led a second group. Gabriel led a third. Ruth, despite her age, led a fourth, consisting primarily of the elderly and the very young who could not move quickly. Comfort stayed behind temporarily, tasked with creating distractions and confusion that would delay any pursuit. The groups were to reunite at a predetermined location 40 miles north, where contacts with the Underground Railroad would take over and guide them toward the Ohio River and ultimately toward Canada. The escape was not flawless. Nothing involving 63 people moving through hostile territory could be flawless. One group got lost in the mountains and wandered for 3 days before finding the correct path. Several people became sick from exposure and contaminated water. 2 elderly men died during the journey, their bodies buried in unmarked graves in the forest. And pursuit did come, eventually, when Solomon Hartwell woke the next morning to find his slave quarters empty and realized what had happened. He organized a posse of local slaveholders and hired slave catchers, offering a substantial reward for the return of his property. The hunters tracked the escapees for nearly 2 weeks, following signs through the wilderness, questioning residents of mountain farms, posting notices in every town. They captured 11 people in total, finding them at various stages of exhaustion and desperation scattered across the mountains. But they did not capture Patience. They did not capture the core group of leaders. and they did not prevent 47 people from eventually reaching free territory, an astonishing success rate for an escape of this scale. Patience herself was never recaptured. The last confirmed sighting of her was at a farmhouse in southern Ohio, where she stayed for several days, recovering from the journey before continuing north. Where she ultimately went, whether she reached Canada, whether she lived out her days in freedom, or was eventually caught and returned to bondage, remains unknown. Some accounts suggest she settled in a community of former slaves in Ontario, where she practiced medicine until her death in the 1870s. Others claim she returned south during the Civil War, serving as a nurse and spy for the Union Army, using her skills and her knowledge of the terrain to aid the cause that would finally destroy the institution she had fought against for so long. Still others insist she never left the Appalachian Mountains, that she established a hidden community deep in the wilderness where escaped slaves could find refuge, and that she spent her remaining years as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, guiding others to the freedom she had won for herself. The truth is lost to history, buried like so much of the enslaved experience beneath layers of deliberate erasure and enforced forgetting. What is not lost is her legacy. The method she developed, the technique of preventing enslaved births as a form of resistance, spread throughout the South in the years following the Hartwell Exodus. It became known by various names in different regions: the cold womb, the empty cradle, the barren ground. Slaveholders wrote about it in increasingly panicked letters, documenting the phenomenon without understanding it, attributing it to curses, to diseases, to divine punishment, to anything except the deliberate actions of the enslaved women themselves. Medical journals published confused articles attempting to explain the demographic patterns that were emerging across the plantation South. Agricultural societies convened emergency meetings to discuss the crisis in human reproduction. The economic model of slavery depended fundamentally on the enslaved population growing through natural increase, and that growth was faltering in ways that could not be explained by any factor the slaveholders were willing to consider. They could not accept that the women they owned, the women they raped, the women they forced to bear children for profit, had found ways to resist at the most fundamental level possible. They could not accept that the womb itself could become a weapon. The Hartwell plantation never recovered from the Exodus. Solomon Hartwell died in 1849, impoverished and broken. His estate sold at auction for a fraction of its former value. The land passed through a series of owners, none of whom could make it profitable, none of whom could explain the persistent problems with fertility that plagued any livestock brought to the property. Eventually, the fields were abandoned, the buildings demolished or allowed to collapse, the forest permitted to reclaim what had once been cleared for agriculture. By the early 20th century, nothing remained of the plantation except scattered foundation stones and the memories preserved in local folklore. The place became known as Cold Womb Hollow, and the stories about why it bore that name became increasingly distorted as they passed from generation to generation. Some versions attributed the infertility to a witch who had cursed the land. Others blamed restless spirits of the enslaved dead. Others simply acknowledged that something terrible had happened there, something that had left a mark on the earth itself, something that could never be fully healed or fully forgotten. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that have marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who you are and recognize who truly cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if the story of patience touched your heart. Share it so that the memory of patience may never be forgotten. The old-timers in the valleys surrounding Cold Womb Hollow still tell stories about a woman who appears in the mist on certain autumn mornings, walking the paths that once connected the slave quarters to the main house, carrying herbs in her hands and purpose in her eyes. They say she checks on the land, ensuring that nothing grows there, ensuring that the curse she placed remains in effect, ensuring that the wound she opened in the earth never heals. They say she is waiting for something, though they do not agree on what. Some believe she waits for an apology that will never come. Others believe she waits for the last descendant of Solomon Hartwell to die, at which point she will finally rest. Others believe she waits for nothing at all, that she simply exists as a reminder, a permanent testament to what happens when human beings are treated as property, when women's bodies are treated as factories, when the natural bonds between mother and child are severed and commodified by those who see other people as nothing more than sources of profit. Whatever she waits for, she has not stopped waiting. The mist still rises in Cold Womb Hollow. The earth still refuses to bear fruit there. And somewhere in the forest, in a grave that no one has ever found, the body of a woman named Patience lies in soil that she made sacred through the terrible weight of her choices. She could not give life to freedom, so she gave death to bondage. And in doing so, she ensured that the question she struggled with would echo through history forever. Is it mercy or murder to prevent a life that would be lived in chains? No one has ever answered that question satisfactorily. Perhaps no one ever will, but the question itself is her monument, her legacy, her gift to the future that she could not see but helped to create. The mother of the cold womb sleeps in the Appalachian earth, and the Appalachian earth remembers what she did, and the memory refuses to die.